Hey guys, welcome. Today we are starting a brand new unit number 3 in American history. We are going to be talking about the age of imperialism. Very exciting unit. We will see the first war that the United States will engage in as a part of our curriculum here, the Spanish-American War. Often not a very well-remembered war, but as we are going to see, it had major implications for the future of the United States. We're also going to take a look at what's happening globally, the rise of imperialism, how places like Africa are being carved up by European empires, and ultimately, by the end, we're going to see America emerge as one of the major players in the world, something that we kind of tend to forget that America being a global power is only a very recent thing. So anyways, I hope you enjoy it. Today we're going to talk about the background of imperialism, and we're going to see eventually how the United States got a foothold in their empire business with the future state of Hawaii. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our notes. All right, so imperialism. Here we go. So imperialism, just a basic definition here. A policy when stronger nations extend their economic, political, or military power over weaker territories. So these weaker territories are called colonies. So they're the ones that are producing things for, especially raw materials for the empire. And in return, those markets, those people are expected to really buy things from the empire. So, it's kind of it's a major benefit for the empire. You get resources at either free or a discounted rate, and then you're able to, use those resources in industrialization to then sell those finished products back to the people in those colonies. So that's kind of it's a very heavy relationship, and we're going to see that even though there were some benefits, overall, imperialism, frankly, just doesn't last because it is a dominating situation, a powerful nation over a weaker nation, and that's really what you need to know from it. The purpose of imperialism, as it states there, is to gain overseas markets. And by market, I just mean the the ability to trade people goods, your goods. And remember, this is during the time of industrialization, so where mass production is becoming even more readily accessible to these countries. And then they're also gaining source for raw materials, as I stated. So let's take a look at the current state of kind of global politics, what's happening from around 1890 to 1920. So by this point, you have kind of the major players on the world stage. You have the British, the French, the Belgians, all of these European nations that from the old world that have established pretty large empires. They said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and they were technically correct. They held so much land throughout the world that there was literally the sun shining on a piece of it at every moment during the day. But let's take a look at the relationship, or at least the reasons for that. Oh, and I missed that last part. Smaller or weaker nations are targeted by empires for their natural resources and cheap labor. Places like China, India, Africa, places where poverty is much more standard. These powerful, rich nations are going to come into these weaker, often more populated nations, but they're going to be able to pay a lot less. And we still have this today in some instance. I mean, you go, things like outsourcing, where you have companies go to places where they can pay people a lot less than the minimum wage here, and have just as good of a product, if not better. So the reasons for global imperialism, why are these nations engaging in it? And I think you're already seeing some of the benefits for those empires here. But economics, that's frankly, I think, the biggest reason. I put it first because, this is the age of the Industrial Revolution, and you need those raw materials. You got a nation like Great Britain, where it's frankly a tiny island. They're limited in their resources. And so early on, they establish a very strong navy, and that navy allows them to get any place in the globe that they need to. It kind of was a natural evolution then with the pressures of industrialization to go out and find resources from outside, not justifying it, but explaining, why these things happen. So, as more goods are produced, it kind of spurs this frankly, kind of a race to see who can gobble up the most territory within their empire. So you kind of have this land race going on, and we're going to see a couple areas that are hit pretty hard by this. I also put up there the social reasons for global imperialism. It's I think kind of one of the tougher things to talk about. But there is this belief in racial superiority among European nations that I guess it's kind of two ways. Number one, they do feel as if they're racially superior to many of the places they're going in, that these civilizations are backwards, that, here you go into places like Africa, and even though, in many areas very, very advanced, what they see is people still living in tribal settings, and they're saying, terms that they would use, savages, have not even figured out how to, make a spinning wheel. So in that instance, with that mindset, they actually saw it as a benefit to the colonies, that they were going in and spreading their own civilization to it. You might be familiar with the story, The Jungle Book, okay? Of course, a famous Disney, cartoon. That was based off of a book called The Jungle Book by a man named Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling was a British citizen. He had first-hand experience with empire. He had been raised in India, but he saw kind of the relationship there. And he wrote a poem in this time period called The White Man's Burden. And historians like to point to this as, really a great summary of how many of those European nations felt at this time, because frankly, it is quite racist. I mean, it is dealing with issues of white superiority, but saying white man's burden, it's our burden to go in and to spread civilization, to take the light to the darkness. And we saw this already in our first unit with Westward Movement, Manifest Destiny. That Americans were destined to do this. So they're bringing with them technology. They're bringing with them things like religion, Christianity in particular, to people that they deem to be inferior. And, we've come a long ways since, of course, but, it's an important part of understanding why they, so readily went into these areas. And also there's this political, race going on. We are at this point, we're less than 20 years out from World War I, where basically the pressures in Europe have culminated to a point where, war breaks out really within the period of a month. Part of that pressure that is building is, kind of an arms race of sorts, but a land grab as well, as I mentioned earlier. There's this idea of social Darwinism. You might be familiar with Charles Darwin, theory of evolution. Part of that theory of evolution is that the strongest survive, right? The strongest traits survive to the next generation, but also the strongest, animals, right? So, the pack of gazelle in Africa, being chased by a lion, they would, the lion's going to get the weakest one in the back, the smallest, the slowest. And people, and the ones in front are going to escape, the strongest, the fastest. People began to apply this to society, saying, these same principles exist in society, in the globe. It makes sense that a strong nation like Germany would gobble up a weaker nation, say, for instance, in the future, like Poland. So, this idea of social Darwinism, I think, is also present in explaining why other nations, why European nations in particular, are going out and dominating weaker nations, because, frankly, they can, and they think that it's just kind of the next stage, that everyone's going to be doing this. And for the most part, all the powerful nations were. No one's taking a moral stand saying, oh, we shouldn't. No, they're all doing it. And if you don't, you're going to be left behind, right? So I think, again, not explaining, it's not right, but explaining the mentality of the day. We're going to take a look at a couple case studies where imperialism heavily affected the people of these nations and continents. The first is Africa. And Africa, more so than any other place on the planet, has been affected heavily by colonization. I'd like you to take a look at that map on the screen. A very colorful map, and that map is showing you all the different European countries that had carved up Africa. You see, by the late 1800s, 1884, they realized that there was starting to be some conflict within Africa. The coastlines, for the most part, had already been claimed, but technology allowed for the first time ever, things like railroad and other industrial age inventions. It allowed them to travel to the deepest parts, steamship in particular, allowed them to travel to the deepest parts of Africa that people really hadn't been to before. And that opened the door for colonization within those areas. So, European nations realized, listen, we don't want to fight a war over this. So they got together in 1884 in the city of Berlin, Germany. And at that conference, they literally sat around a table with a blank map of Africa, and they basically carved it out for themselves. And you can see that newspaper drawing there of what that would look like. Now, one thing you will notice is who is missing, and that would be any African representation at all. This was a group of old white guys, literally thousands of miles away, deciding the fates of millions of people. And although it kept peace between the European nations, this moment right here is going to drastically impact African history for up to current day, because these lines that are being drawn by these Europeans are not taking into account any cultural differences. You had tribes that had been warring forever that were lumped all of a sudden into the same country, and those old rivalries, even though they may be calmed down by this imperial structure, they will emerge in the 1960s with a vengeance. And we've had a lot of political instability in Africa over the last half century, and a big part of it's because of this. A lot of tension is building during this period of colonization. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. By 1913, only Ethiopia and Liberia remain as independent nations, and even then, you would have Ethiopia gobbled up by Italy in the preceding years of World War II. The other area that is highly affected is China. Now, China is going to be a little bit different because, this was a situation to where, frankly, it was a wealth of resources. And the European nations, once again, they did not want to go to war over this, but they did see this tremendous opportunity for the markets in China, for them to sell their goods, and they wanted to take advantage of that. So they are going to carve it up, kind of like this political cartoon suggests. They're going to carve it up. And by the way, I do want to mention, I'm going to include a number of political cartoons in here, and many of them have derogatory images of those being portrayed. I think it's interesting to note how they portray the Chinese in these political cartoons. Again, it's hard for us to really discuss, but this is a very racist time period globally, not just in the United States, globally. This is kind of the first era of globalization where these nations really have not interacted, and there's a lot of racism that remains rampant. So sometimes that does come out in the political cartoon. So again, not condoning it, but I thought this illustration kind of accurately portrayed how the European nations felt about China. They were willing to carve it up amongst themselves with no input from the Chinese. Well, what they're going to do in China is a little bit different from Africa, where in Africa they carved it up and each nation kind of got their own, colony there. In China, it's going to be different. They're going to have what they call spheres of influence, where European nations won't take over the entire country, but instead major port cities and even pushing inward a little bit. You can see there by 1910 you have France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia, all of them involved in having a sphere of influence within China. And the Chinese didn't necessarily welcome this either. Most of these countries did not welcome this intrusion because, at the end of the day, people are dying, as these soldiers are moving in to enforce these policies. And in the case of China, this had been happening for a long time. One of the craziest stories that I think shows the horrors of imperialism is the example of the Opium Wars. In 1840, the British had begun trading in China, again, unwelcome. And in particular, the Chinese had a major issue with some of the goods that they were selling, in particular the drug opium. Now, the British were basically growing opium in India, and then picking it up on the way from India to China and then selling it to the Chinese. It's a drug. It's a heavily addictive drug. Today, they make heroin out of opium and many pharmaceuticals. This is a highly addictive drug, and what the Chinese government realized was by the late 1830s, they basically had a massive drug problem on their hand, with opium dens being opened throughout the country. And so they demanded Britain stop selling opium in their country. Britain refused. Britain said that basically they had the right to sell drugs, any good that they wanted, and that China didn't have the right to say no. It resulted in a war. In fact, there would be multiple wars over this, but the Opium Wars, in which, of course, Britain, being the modern industrial power, won the right to sell drugs. If that shows you where the moral line is in imperialism, I don't know what else will if that doesn't. Eventually nations like China do become fed up with these intrusions, and one of the good examples of how some countries fought back was the Boxer Rebellion. And this started as kind of an internal fight where you had this rebel group rise up, and they basically challenged any foreigner. That foreigners, they wanted them out of the country, and started killing them, even missionaries that were there. And so it turned into a large-scale rebellion at first, but then ultimately a war. And this is one of the first world wars, even though that would be tied to, of course, the war that'll come in 1914. But this is a global conflict for sure, because you had 8 nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, that basically allied in order to put down this rebellion and to fight China. So again, this is the problem with imperialism. It's not just about trade, right? It's about forcing trade. It's about going into a country, dominating them, forcing them to follow your policy, and then killing them if they don't follow along. This is how imperialism works. So at the end of the day, you might have cheaper goods, but at what cost? You've killed a lot of innocent people often to get those goods. So let's talk about how America got involved in this race. And again, America is not a major power at this point. We have just barely extended from sea to shining sea at this point. We have not gone beyond that, beyond the coastline. There is no state of Hawaii. There is no state of Alaska. Those would come later on. So I want to briefly take you through just kind of reminiscing of the U.S. role in expansion. I mentioned Manifest Destiny early on. We talked about it in our Westward Movement unit in the first unit. But this idea that America was fated to reach the Pacific. And the problem with that is that it wasn't our land, first of all. America started out as 13 colonies, right? But you think about, how did we get all the way to from sea to shining sea? Well, it happened both through negotiation, through purchase, but also through war. And again, that land was not empty either. Even though we would beat the Mexicans in a war, that land had settlers, but it also had native peoples, and we often leave them out of this story. Just a quick rundown there. 1803, Louisiana Purchase, doubled America's size. 1845, Texas is annexed. That was just Mexico. That was, a third of Mexico that was basically just taken by the United States. And then, of course, with the Mexican Cession that followed, adding everything from Utah, Colorado, Nevada, California, New Mexico, Arizona, all of that became the United States. It was half of Mexico that we basically took in that war. Again, another major power kind of dominating a much weaker power in Mexico. My point in showing you all this is to kind of get this underlying understanding. America always has been an imperialistic nation. The only difference between us and Europe is that Europe was mainly getting their colonies overseas. We were adding to our own country, and sometimes illegally. The Mexican-American War, even Civil War hero and future President Ulysses S. Grant basically said that the Civil War was to pay for the sins of the Mexican-American War. He thought that war was illegal, and here this man was president. That we took this land. So we are not immune to this. I'm proud of most of our history, but we're going to talk about some things where America did some shady stuff at this time, and not really American morals were really called upon during this age of expansion. That image that's we looked at the beginning, I think this really explains manifest destiny, bringing the light to the darkness. That was kind of a common idea. So why did America feel the need to expand? And this will echo some of the reasons we mentioned earlier. Resources. Okay, of course, the West is very rich in resources, but the West isn't going to have everything. And in fact, one area that the West is not good at producing, and really nowhere within America is good at producing, is sugar. All right, we need someplace that grows sugar because sugar is very expensive, and if you can take land and grow your sugar there, you have you don't have to buy it from anyone. So we're going to see that the first major area that we take over, Hawaii, rich in sugar, and big reason why we took that country. The second reason, military. As I said, there's kind of an arms race growing, and especially with the world's navies. America understood, especially after the writing of this man, Alfred Mahan, who wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power on History. He said, listen, the greatest powers in world history had strong navies. And at this point, America it was lagging behind. We didn't have hardly any major modern ships. In fact, still had a number of wooden vessels that were being used in the Navy. So he said, listen, America, if they want to get their act together, they need to do the following things. First of all, you got to have a strong Navy. You got to start rebuilding that Navy to protect shipping lanes. Now, granted, once you have the weapons, once you have the boats, it becomes much easier to engage in war, but they're saying here for defensive purposes. Number two, you need to have naval bases around the globe. Again, if you want to increase your economic power, you need to be trading with nations far away from the United States. So you need to have a naval base halfway there so, your ships can refuel and, the Navy can get to you if there's any problems. Number three, it was also suggested by Mahan that America build a canal in Panama. Now, the French had attempted this for well over a decade. They had attempted to build a canal in the tiny nation of Panama. You can see it in that map in the bottom there. There's a stretch in Panama of 10 miles that on one side you have the Atlantic, and on the other side you have the Pacific. The suggestion by Mahan here is to go in and complete that canal. If the United States could control a canal here and you could basically move through that canal, your ships, it would prevent you from having to go all the way around South America. Well, that would save you literally weeks in some cases. So a very important step that, of course, America will take, and we'll talk about that later. The fourth suggestion from Mahan was to build a modern fleet. It's not just enough to have a bunch of boats. You got to have a modern navy in order to, flex your muscles. So we're going to see that advice is followed. From 1883 to 1890, we're going to build a number of modern vessels. We're getting closer towards battleships. We're not really going to see that until a little bit later on. The British come up with what's called the dreadnought. But these are getting very close. The USS Maine, which will become a very important piece in our next lecture. The USS Oregon, these become our, some of our newest vessels. And it works. Within a few short years, America becomes the third strongest navy in the world. So we have the weapons. How will we choose to use them? The third reason Americans got involved in imperialism, again, echoing the global trend here, but there were ideas of racial superiority, and we've seen that even with our own domestic expansion. The plight of the Native Americans, not treated well at all. This idea of white man's burden, social Darwinism, as I covered earlier. We've seen it also with immigrants. We looked at things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, at this age of immigration where we have millions of people coming in from Italy and England at the same time on the West Coast. We're saying, no, you cannot come in because you are coming from China, okay, specifically. So, there's some racial reasons that we actually block immigration, believe it or not. All right. Again, another political cartoon, very, I think, telling of, the ideas at the time. And, again, we have to understand that the depictions here, of course, would have been acceptable at the time, but obviously very skewed. I think there's a lot of interesting things happening here. First of all, just the scene itself. You have Uncle Sam, the symbolic figure of the United States, and obviously he's teaching a class. You have the very, well-behaved students in the back who are reading their books, and if you get close enough, you can see that each of those books and each of those children represent a state that is currently in the Union. But you have 4 new students in the front of the room: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. Now, we're going to talk about all of those and how they became a part of the United States empire after the Spanish-American War. But notice how the artist is depicting them as unruly, as savages, not kept like those that are currently in. So it's going to be Uncle Sam's job to get them in line. Again, a lot of racial elements here. A couple other areas to note. Look at who's knocking on the door, wanting in. You have that Chinese child who is wanting to be a part of this, but yet is being denied access. Also stuck over in the corner, you have the Native American with his book actually upside down. So the artist saying, kind of a lost cause there. And then in the very back, which I think is extremely telling, you have an African American boy who is cleaning the windows. And so he's a part of this classroom, but he's not partaking in the education. He's doing the manual labor. Now, this says a lot about America at the time. And I think today it is an extremely sad reflection of what the current state was at that time. Now, it's not as if everybody was on board with having an empire. After all, we were born out of fighting against an empire, right? We kind of forget about that whole, tyranny of the king thing when we want to become the big bad bosses ourselves. But there were groups of people that were opposed to imperialism, and they had a variety of reasons. First of all, there were many moral implications, right? The Constitution does not say anything about taking over other nations. Okay, and I think the founding fathers would have been flipping in their graves had they known that Americans were debating whether it was right or not to go in and to invade and overtake a foreign nation just for the resources. Like, that's so beyond what we were founded for. It's unbelievable, really. But many people said, if we really are a land of liberty and equality, how can you justify us dominating another country, another group of peoples? And that, frankly, it's not constitutional. And frankly, they were right. And we're going to talk about that later. They also said, you have to be wary of the practical reasons. When you get an empire, you have to defend that empire. And part of that is having a strong military. And there's nothing wrong with being able to defend oneself, but it is very costly to defend an empire. And we're going to find that out both in blood and treasure when it comes to a nation later on, the Philippines, where we lose thousands of men trying to defend this colony that did not want us there. Fast forward to today, and I think, especially, that line about the strong military, we're seeing the remnants of this period. They're making decisions in this period, 1890s, that are going to still affect us to this day. You can see there the amount that America spends on its military today, $711 billion, compared to, I think that's about the top 10 nations next to us in that graph. The most powerful nations on earth besides the United States, how much they're spending on their military combined versus us. It's costly to have a very expensive military. Again, nothing wrong with having, the ability to defend oneself. And of course, America should have a strong military, being, superpower that we are. But it comes at a cost, and we need to, be aware of that. You can see the bottom one talking about military bases around the world and, U.S. troop presence. And again, this is probably more a reflection of what comes in the Cold War, but still, this area that we're studying, it's the beginning of it, and it's worthy of discussing. All right, so our final section today, sorry, running a little bit longer than usual, but our final section, we're going to talk about how we started our empire with the, or I guess outside of our continental boundaries, with the nation of Hawaii, and it was its own nation at the time. We had used it as a merchant stop since the 1790s. We had been going to Hawaii. By the 1850s, Americans had started moving into Hawaii and setting up sugar plantations. I alluded to that earlier, but sugar is booming at this time, and Hawaii was one place that you could grow it. It's hot, it's humid, it's tropical. You can't do that in places like Iowa. Okay, so you can see there by the 1850s, Americans owned about 3/4 of the wealth in Hawaii. We moved in. And we were the most powerful, rich entity within Hawaii, not the native peoples of Hawaii, but the American immigrants that came there. You had the American government working with the Hawaiian government, which again, it was its own country at the time. It was a monarchy. It had their own king. In 1875, there was a treaty that allowed Hawaiian sugar into the United States tax-free, and that was a good thing. It really increased trade between the two nations. By 1887, you can see the powerful Americans on the Hawaiian Islands start to strong-arm the king. They force him to change the Constitution to allow only landowners the ability to vote. Now, as I just mentioned in the last slide, who owns all the land? Well, mainly Americans by this point. So what this means is that the Hawaiian Constitution now states that really only Americans can vote. Well, that's a problem for the native peoples. In 1887, we signed a treaty with Hawaii, which allows us to establish a naval base, fulfilling Mahan's desire in that book we discussed earlier. This naval base will become known as Pearl Harbor, and will completely stay out of American history for the rest of time. Just kidding. We're going to talk about Pearl Harbor a lot. 1890, McKinley Tariff Bill. This we had mentioned in our last unit as really, having a horrible effect on the American economy, really destroyed it. So what the McKinley Tariff Bill did was it basically raised the tariffs on all these imported goods, including Hawaiian sugar. Well, when they did that, the exports from Hawaii just plummeted, and so all those Americans in Hawaii, they're saying, "Hey, you guys aren't buying our sugar anymore." They start petitioning their senators and representatives to what we call annex Hawaii, okay? To annex. And if they thought if Hawaii could become a part of the United States, then they would not have to pay that tax. And by the way, this is the basis for why we take over the country, why we invade a foreign nation, is so the wealthy people on that island don't have to pay a tax. Annexation, an important term you need to know, to attach as an addition. So this does not require the approval of those within it. Okay, the government basically, if they pass a resolution saying that we are annexing a territory, we can move in and do it according to our own laws. The laws of that nation may differ. We did this in Texas, even though it was a part of Mexico. We annexed it, said, well, now it's a part of the United States, and we fought a war over it. In 1891, the Hawaiian king dies. He is replaced by his sister, Queen Liliuokalani. Now, Queen Liliuokalani was very headstrong, and she understood that this nation of Hawaii was being overrun by these wealthy Americans. And so she instituted some changes immediately. She got rid of that landowner requirement to vote, which made a lot of people, a lot of Americans, wealthy Americans, mad. And so basically, she is really kind of taking it to the Americans there. Well, that was kind of the last straw. The Americans basically revolt, and they get the help of the United States ambassador. Here you have the diplomat from the U.S. government aiding in this overthrow of the Hawaiian government. A man named John L. Stevens. He actually calls on Marines that are stationed at Pearl Harbor to help overthrow the government of Hawaii. Now, once they do that successfully and imprison the Queen, they set up a temporary government, a provisional government, with Sanford B. Dole as the president. Dole, you might know that name, the fruit company. Ambassador Stevens recognizes this provisional government, says, yes, this is, the acting government of Hawaii. And they send a message to the U.S. government saying, hey, guess what? The Queen's gone. We've taken over. It's a great time to annex our country. Well, at the time, President Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, who was an anti-imperialist, said, no way. Like, that's illegal what you just did. You have to give that land back. The president refuses, but But basically, Ambassador Stevens says, and Governor Dole at this time said, you know what, we don't have to wait for you to change your mind. We just have to wait for you to be out of a job. And that's basically what they did. They waited for Cleveland's administration to run out because they knew that in 1896 a new election might put a pro-imperialist person in the White House, and that's exactly what happened. 1897, McKinley is inaugurated, becomes president, and he does favor expansion, and he gets Congress to annex Hawaii within the next year. Hawaii had no vote in that. Okay, we overthrew their government by force with the Marines, and we added it as a U.S. territory without any voice from the Hawaiian people. The U.S. government would actually apologize in 1993 for this. A little awkward now that they're a state, I guess, but still, they made it known that this was wrong, and it was wrong then, it's wrong today, and there's still a lot of animosity from Native Hawaiians to the federal government. Now, granted, there's been a lot of benefit with tourism and all that, but ultimately, it was an illegal coup that overthrew that country and should be recognized as such. Now, next time we're going to talk about Spain, and we'll get involved in the Spanish-American War. So thank you for tuning in, and as always, shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.